Today, a gas station is usually a quick stop. Pump your fuel, grab a drink, and get back on the road. In 1970s America, service stations were places where people expected actual service. Before we continue, a quick important update about the channel. I just enabled channel memberships, giving you a way to support these documentaries directly. And honestly, that means a lot. Support like this helps me spend more time researching, writing, and creating these long-form stories for you. Thank you to everyone who watches, shares, and helps keep this history alive. Now, let's go back. Picture late 1973. The line at the corner station wraps around the block, sometimes 2 blocks. Drivers sit with their engines off to save what little fuel they have left, radios playing low, waiting their turn at a pump that might run dry before they ever reach it. Some stations have already closed for the day, a hand-lettered sign taped across the glass. Sorry, no gas today. Down the line, a horn sounds now and then, less out of anger than out of nerves. Nobody's quite sure how long this is going to last. And underneath all that waiting, something else is happening too. People are realizing for the first time in their lives that the gas station, that small, unremarkable patch of pavement and pumps they had barely thought about before, has suddenly become one of the most important stops of their entire week. That stretch of lines in the final months of 1973 and into 1974 would change the American gas station for good. But to really understand what changed, you first have to understand what a gas station actually was before any of that happened. Because on an ordinary afternoon with no shortage anywhere in sight, getting gas in America in the 1970s looked almost nothing like it does today. In October 1973, Arab members of OPEC announced an oil embargo against the United States, a response to American support for Israel during the Yom Kippur War. The decision itself was made in oil ministries thousands of miles away, around tables most Americans would never see. But the effects didn't stay there. Crude oil shipments slowed, refineries had less to work with, and within weeks, gasoline that had always simply been there, sitting quietly underground waiting to be pumped, was suddenly scarce and noticeably more expensive when it could be found at all. It wasn't the only energy shock of the decade. A second one would follow in 1979 after the Iranian Revolution. But this first one, in the closing months of 1973, was the moment that forced ordinary Americans to think about gasoline as something that could actually run out. And it landed squarely on top of a service culture that had spent 30 years building itself around the opposite idea entirely, that filling your tank should be effortless and that someone else would handle the details. Across the driveway of nearly every station sat a thin rubber hose, and when a car rolled over it, a bell rang somewhere inside the station office. That bell was the whole system. An attendant, usually in a company uniform, a patch over the chest with a star, a shell, a winged horse, whichever brand owned the pumps that week, would step out wiping his hands on a rag and ask some version of the same friendly question. "Fill her up?" Nobody got out of the car. You stayed behind the wheel, rolled the window down a few inches if you wanted to talk, and let someone else handle the rest. It wasn't framed as a luxury, it was simply how a gas station worked, the same way you'd expect a waiter to bring a menu without being asked. While the tank filled, the attendant rarely just stood there watching the numbers spin. He'd pop the hood and check the oil with the dipstick, wiping it on the rag before sliding it back in to read the level a second time. He'd glance at the radiator. He'd walk around the car with a squeegee and clean the windshield front and back, sometimes pausing to scrape off a dead bug or a streak of dried mud near the wiper blade. If the tires looked a little low, he'd crouch down with a gauge and top off the air. No extra charge. None of this was an upsell. It came bundled into the price of the gallon, the same way you wouldn't expect to pay extra for a glass of water at a diner. Drivers expected it because, frankly, it had always been there. Stations competed hard for regular customers, and one of the easiest ways to win loyalty was to give something away. Many handed out trading stamps with every fill-up, sometimes green stamps, sometimes a station's own house brand, which families pasted into little books and eventually redeemed for toasters, lamps, or dinnerware at a redemption center across town. Esso ran one of the most memorable promotions of the era. Put a tiger in your tank, handing out little plush tiger tails that kids loved tying to the car antenna. Other stations gave out free road maps, souvenir drinking glasses, commemorative coins, or a paper fan in the middle of summer. None of it cost the station much, but it added up to something bigger in the customer's mind. The sense that this particular station wanted your business enough to throw in a little something extra every single visit without you ever having to ask. For a lot of families, there was really only one station, the one a few blocks from home, run by the same man for years, sometimes decades. He knew which car was yours before you'd even pulled all the way in. He remembered that it had been making a strange noise the week before and asked, without being prompted, whether it had stopped. Plenty of these stations weren't just rows of pumps. They had a service bay attached with a hydraulic lift and a mechanic who could handle a tune-up, a brake job, or a state inspection sticker the same afternoon you brought the car in. You didn't shop around for trust the way people do online reviews today. You already had it, built up one oil change and one small favor at a time. Long before bank-issued credit cards were common, most drivers carried a small embossed card from a single oil company. Texaco, Sinclair, Phillips 66, Esso, tucked into the glove box for exactly these stops. The attendant would run it through a manual imprinter, the kind that pressed the raised numbers onto a carbon slip with a satisfying clack of the handle, and hand it back along with the receipt to sign on the hood of the car. It tied you to one brand, one network of stations along your usual routes, and it meant the attendant behind the counter often recognized the name on the card before he even looked at the face behind the wheel. Gas stations weren't just functional, they were landmarks. The green Sinclair Dinosaur, the red Texaco Star, the orange Phillips 66 Shield glowing on a tall pole sign at night. These became fixed points people used to give directions long before GPS. Turn left at the Shell station meant something specific and immediate to anyone who lived nearby. The hum of the compressor, the smell of gasoline mixed with hot asphalt, the click of a pump handle locking into place. These were small, ordinary sensations that, decades later, instantly bring people back to a particular summer or a particular car. Long before interstate rest stops and 24-hour pharmacies, the gas station bathroom was often the only public restroom for miles, and most stations kept the key chained to something heavy and impossible to lose. A block of wood, an old hubcap, a length of pipe, so it wouldn't wander off in someone's glove compartment. On long family drives, the station was also where you picked up a free paper road map from a rack near the door, the attendant sometimes tracing a route with his finger and circling the next town over in case you needed gas again before dark. For a family heading out on summer vacation, the gas station wasn't just a stop along the trip. It was part of how the trip got planned in the first place. For a lot of kids, the gas station was a small adventure folded into an ordinary errand. There was a soda machine outside, the kind where you slid a glass bottle out through a metal gate after dropping in your coins. There was the hiss and clunk of the hydraulic lift in the service bay, visible through a window if you stood on your toes. Some kids got to hold the squeegee and help wash the windshield while their dad talked with the attendant about the weather, the Sunday game, or whatever had broken on the car the last time. It wasn't a big moment by any measure, it just felt, somehow, like a small piece of the week worth remembering. For a huge number of American teenagers in the 1970s, the gas station was also where they got their very first paycheck. You learned to work the register, to count change quickly with someone waiting in the car, to read a dipstick correctly the first time so you weren't embarrassed in front of a customer twice your age. The owner usually taught you himself, standing close by for the first few fill-ups before trusting you to handle a car alone. It was loud, greasy, and not particularly glamorous work, but it taught a kind of quiet responsibility. Handling someone else's car, someone else's money, someone else's evening commute that a lot of people who lived through it still mention decades later when they talk about their first real job. When the embargo hit in the closing months of 1973, that whole personal, almost neighborly system collided head-on with a national emergency. The federal government scrambled to respond. President Nixon created the Federal Energy Office that December to oversee fuel allocation, and within weeks, states began experimenting with rationing systems to ease the chaos building at the pump. The most common version became known as odd-even rationing. If the last digit on your license plate was odd, you could only buy gas on odd-numbered days of the month. An even digit meant even days. Written out like that, it sounds almost bureaucratic. In practice, it reorganized people's entire week. When you could run errands, when you could visit family, whether you could even get to work reliably, all hinging on a single digit stamped onto a metal plate. In January 1974, Nixon signed the Emergency Highway Energy Conservation Act, setting a national speed limit of 55 miles per hour to conserve fuel, a law that in one form or another would stay on the books for more than 2 decades. For a stretch that same winter, the country even experimented with keeping clocks on daylight saving time straight through the darkest months, trying to squeeze a little more daylight and a little less furnace and headlight use out of every day. Out on the highways, independent truckers staged slowdowns and blockades that winter, protesting fuel costs and the new speed limit together, snarling traffic on stretches of interstate, and putting the fuel crisis on the evening news in a way that was impossible to ignore. None of this landed evenly. Federal price controls, left over from earlier inflation-fighting measures, meant a gallon of gas often cost about the same in one state as another. But the actual supply allocated to each region didn't always match where the demand was heaviest. A station in one part of town might have a steady delivery, while one a few miles away ran dry by mid-afternoon, and there was no obvious reason for it to a driver who had simply picked the wrong corner that week. That unevenness, more than the shortage itself, is part of what made the whole experience feel so disorienting. It wasn't just that gas was scarce, it was that nobody could quite predict where or when it would be scarce next. None of these were small adjustments tucked away in some government office. They reached directly into commutes, school runs, and weekend plans, all because of a shortage that had started in a negotiation most Americans would never see and could not have influenced even if they'd wanted to. But here's the part people don't talk about quite as often. The shortage didn't just cost time, it changed how people treated each other at the pump. Tempers genuinely frayed. Newspapers that winter carried stories of shouting matches breaking out in line, of drivers cutting ahead and provoking shoving, of station owners standing watch over their own pumps just to keep order among customers who, on any other day, would have waited their turn without a second thought. For a country that had built so much of its self-image around abundance, around the simple assumption that you could always just go, always just fill up and drive wherever you wanted, that quiet fear of running out cut deeper than the inconvenience alone. And yet, alongside the friction, something quieter and more human showed up too. Neighbors who barely spoke before started carpooling to work to stretch their ration days further. Families consolidated several short errands into a single careful trip instead of making 3 or 4 separate ones. People checked in on elderly neighbors who couldn't easily reach a station on their assigned day, picking up groceries for them or driving them to appointments along the way. None of that made the same headlines as the shouting matches, but it was just as real. A kind of everyday cooperation that only seems to surface when everyone around you is short on the same thing at the same time for reasons none of you control. For a few months, Americans were reminded that the comfort they had always simply assumed was in fact something fragile, something that depended on systems most people never had to think about until the moment those systems broke. The embargo officially ended in March 1974, and supplies slowly eased back through that spring and summer. The lines thinned, then disappeared. Stations went back to keeping their normal hours, and for a while it must have felt like the whole episode had simply closed itself, like a storm that passed through and left the street wet for a day before drying out completely. But not everything snapped back to the way it had been. The 55-mile-per-hour speed limit stayed federal law well into the 1990s, loosened gradually state by state before Congress finally repealed it in 1995. And the full-service model that had defined the gas station for decades never really recovered. Self-service pumps, which had already existed in pockets of the country going back to the 1940s before most states banned them under fire safety codes, suddenly looked far more appealing to station owners trying to protect their margins during a crisis that was squeezing them from every direction at once. State by state, the old bans started coming down through the mid-1970s. A second oil shock in 1979, tied to the Iranian Revolution, brought a fresh round of lines and another sharp reminder of just how thin those margins really were, and it pushed even more stations towards self-service simply to stay open. Through the early 1980s, as card readers eventually made their way onto the pumps themselves, the full-service attendant, the free windshield wash, the trading stamps tucked into the glove box, all of it kept fading one station at a time until it became the exception rather than the rule almost everywhere in the country. Oregon held on to its own self-service ban far longer than most, finally repealing it in 2023, which left New Jersey as the only state in the country that to this day still requires an attendant to pump the gas for you. So what actually changed between then and now? On the surface, it looks like nothing more than convenience. You pull up, tap a card right at the pump, fill your own tank, and drive off. No waiting for an attendant, no small talk about the engine, no detour required if all you wanted was gas. That part of it really is faster, and for most people, genuinely easier than standing around waiting for someone else to finish. But something else slipped away along with the attendant and the bell on the hose. The old system built in small, repeated moments of human contact. A few seconds of conversation, a familiar face who remembered your car, a free check of the oil that nobody ever had to ask for. None of that was strictly necessary to get from one tank of gas to the next, but it was a small, steady thread of community woven into an otherwise unremarkable errand. Today's gas station, for all its speed, is mostly a transaction between a person and a screen. Pay at the pump, maybe a quick stop inside for coffee, restrooms now often locked behind a code typed into a keypad instead of a key chained to a block of wood. In some cities, the attendance booth itself sits behind thick security glass, a small window for cash and a microphone for talking, a far cry from a man leaning casually against your open car door to chat about the weather. The loyalty programs haven't disappeared either, they've just moved onto a phone screen. A points balance in an app instead of a stamp book on the kitchen counter. The transaction is genuinely faster now, and for a lot of practical purposes, that's a real improvement. But it asks less of the people on either side of it. Nobody needs to remember your car, nobody needs to know your name. The convenience is real. So is what got traded away to get it. If you remember those years, the bell on the hose, the windshield wash you never had to ask for, the lines that wrapped around the block in that winter of 1973 and 1974, I'd genuinely like to hear about it. What station did your family go to? Did you collect trading stamps or tie one of those tiger tails to your antenna? Were you out waiting in a gas line yourself, or maybe sitting in the back seat while your parents waited? Leave it in the comments below. These small details are exactly what keep a channel like this one going, and I read every single one of them.